Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for what is now our third lesson in the Black education experience in the United States, Testaments of Courage, Freedom, Resilience, and Dignity. In today's presentation, we're going to look at the question of defining freedom, emancipation, and the creation of the public school. The creation of the public school as compulsory education paid for by the public coffers was both manifest as the idea and determination of the African American community, free and newly freed. Of all stories to be told to correct the historical mission of the contributions of African Americans, this particular omission is probably one of the most egregious. Righting this historic wrong will go a long way toward correcting the vision of U.S. Americans generally toward the African American community and forwarding a vision of Black futures that provides for educational opportunity commensurate with the fundamental contribution the African American community has made in affording free and accessible education for all children in this country. If one were to only read one text to get an honest rendering of this story, one chapter in one book will do. Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880 by W.E.B. Du Bois, is a work of majesty unto itself. Most folks are aware of, most educators in particular are aware of Dr. Du Bois's seminal work, The Souls of Black Folk. But it would be this work, written in 1933, that is known as his magnum opus. There's a chapter in that book entitled The Founding of the Public School that is dedicated, that is Du Bois's treatment of the critical role Black people played in the establishment of the public school system during the Reconstruction era in the United States. Quote from that book, Dr. Du Bois writes, "The first great mass movement for public education at the expense of the state in the South came from Negroes. Many leaders before the war had advocated general education, but few had been listened to. Schools for indigents and paupers were supported here and there, and more or less spasmodically. Some states had elaborate plans, but they were not carried out. Public education for all at public expense was, in the South, a Negro idea." Next, I want to note, before we go any further into this lesson, that the population, that when we're talking about, as Dr. Du Bois does here, the emphasizing Black people in the South, I really want to make clear that in talking about Black people in the South, we are indeed talking about the overwhelming majority of African Americans in the United States at this time. This here is a map of the United States with an emphasis on the population of Black people where we lived at that time in 1850. As you can see, the darker blue colors indicate the proportion of the population of upwards of 90 to 100%. As you can tell, the majority of African Americans, overwhelmingly so at this time, lived in the South itself. Prior to the Civil War, during the Civil War, and immediately following the Civil War, there were some clear obstacles to public education in the United States at this time. For the most part, and with little, difference, public education in the United States was a non-reality. Most children got their education as a consequence of their church affiliation or some private philanthropic institution. Or if you were wealthy, you probably had private tutors brought into the home. But also in Dr. Du Bois's work, Black Reconstruction in America, he identifies the main obstacles to public education at this time, and there were two. Next slide. Because this is so vital, I'm going to read at length from Dr. Du Bois's text. But here in the slide, you will see the main points that I'm about to make. Quote, the fact of the matter was that in the pre-war South, there were two insuperable obstacles to a free public school system. The first was the attitude of the owners of property. They did not propose under any circumstances to be taxed for the public education of the laboring class. They believed that laborers did not need education, that it made their exploitation more difficult, and that if any of them were really worth educating, they would somehow escape their condition by their own efforts. Now, the second obstacle was with the white laborers themselves. They did not demand education and saw no need of it, save in exceptional cases. They accepted without murmur their subordination to the slaveholders and looked for escape from their condition, only to the possibility of becoming slaveholders themselves. Education they regarded as a luxury connected with wealth. It was only the other part of the laboring class, Black folks, who connected knowledge with power, who believed that education was the stepping stone to wealth and respect, and that wealth without education was crippled and corrupt. Perhaps the very fact that so many of them had seen the wealthy slaveholders at close range and knew the extent of ignorance and inefficiency among them led to that extraordinary mass demand on the part of the Black laboring class for education. And it was this demand that was the effective force for the establishment of the public school in the South on a permanent basis for all people and all classes. And that needs to be stressed. At no point in the development of schools by and for African Americans did African Americans deem that those schools ought to be segregated or separated, even from the children of the people who had just previously oppressed them. If the planters opposed schools for poor whites, they all the more regarded Negro schools as absurd. The unalterable conviction of most white Southerners was that Negroes could not and would not learn, and thus their education involved an unjustifiable waste of private property for public disaster. D.R. Gradam, a native Virginian, testified before the Restructuring Committee in 1866 saying, quote, they cannot educate themselves. They are not disposed to educate themselves. But what we know and what history shows us was that African Americans had a very clear answer to D.R. Gradam and other white men who felt similarly. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to highlight, of the many African Americans I could highlight on this particular concern, I will highlight two. Tunis Campbell, an abolitionist, an entrepreneur, and a founder of many schools, both in the North and the South, during this very time period. And then there is also Harriet A. Jacobs, who, if you were a part of our second lesson, heard me discuss her briefly. Harriet A. Jacobs, who herself was born in slavery, would escape slavery and return to the South and build schools at a critical moment following or during even the Civil War. Talking about the life and legacy of Tunis Campbell, a few things need to be noted. Tunis Campbell is recognized as the most influential Black politician in 19th century Georgia. He was born to a free Black family in New Jersey, would attend an Episcopal school in New York, where he was the only Black student. He would found an anti-colonization society in 1832, stating that he would never leave this country until every slave was free on American soil. As a result of his work and efforts, he even established few schools in both New York and New Jersey. In 1863, the then U.S. Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, commissioned the then 51-year-old Campbell to work in Port Royal, South Carolina. With the support of the Freedmen's Bureau, he established the first public schools there. In 1864, he would then be commissioned to supervise land claims and resettlement on the 5 islands off the coast of Georgia. These islands, along with those off the coast of South Carolina, are known as Gullah or Geechee Islands, many of them today. And to this day, in those areas of this country, there are celebrations, annual celebrations to the memory of Tunis Campbell for the contribution that he made in establishing public schools for freed Black persons following the Civil War. Next slide. The second person that we're going to talk about is Harriet A. Jacobs. Harriet A. Jacobs was born in 1813 in slavery in Edenton, North Carolina. After trying to ward off the sexual assault of her owner, she ends up hiding away in a crawl space of the attic of a neighbor for 7 years. Yes, you heard me correctly, for 7 years. It's mind-boggling. After surviving that experience, she would escape to New York, where she would be reunited with her family. These experiences and others that she experienced are captured in the book written by her, entitled Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, that was published in 1861. In locate to DC. Now, if you're aware of civil rights history, that was a pivotal moment. The war has begun. The war is going on. Africans who are escaping the South, plantations in the South, are showing up at the camps of the Union soldiers. They are called contraband. Now, that's very telling. As the property of Southerners, the Confederates, any property taken by the Union was considered contraband. These Africans were called by the Union soldiers contraband. They were kept in prison cells for a time. Harriet A. Jacobs and other African Americans from the North came down into the South to provide support and relief to these newly freed Africans. In her work, 2 years after settling in DC, her daughter would join her, where they would found Jacobs Free School in Alexandria, Virginia. This is the picture of Jacobs Free School in Alexandria, Virginia in 1864. Note the number of children. This is not atypical of the interest, desire, and determination for education among African people at this time. In a letter that Harriet wrote to Lydia Marie Child, who was herself a white abolitionist in the North, she describes her experience of working among this newly freed population of African people in the DC area. In a particular question around that would develop among this new community as to whether or not they would want white Northerners to continue to control their education, or if they wanted to be able to exercise control over their education themselves. In this letter, Harriet describes the situation. I'll read to you what she writes. She says, a question arose whether the white teachers or the colored teachers should be superintendents. The freedmen had built the schoolhouse for their children and were the trustees of the school. So after some discussion, it was decided that it would be best for them to hold a meeting and settle the question for themselves. The result was a decision that the colored teachers should have charge of the school. These people, born and bred in slavery, had always been so accustomed to look upon the white race as their natural superiors and masters that we had some doubts whether they could easily throw off the habit and the fact of their giving preference to colored teachers as managers of the establishment seemed to us to indicate that even their brief possession of freedom had begun to inspire them with respect for their race. These feelings are captured in this statement that was written by and presented to the state legislature in 1865 in Charleston, South Carolina. I want you to note that South Carolina, prior to the Civil War, had amassed a population of Black people that at one point actually exceeded the population of white folks, such that following the Civil War and the development of Reconstruction, African Americans numerically outnumbered white people in South Carolina, and in many counties were the supermajority indeed, such that the government at the state level and at the federal level for South Carolina were indeed represented by freed African Americans. So this statement is being presented to that body, to that political assembly, if you will. The statement captures the sentiment of African Americans during this time period with respect to the importance of education for their people. It reads, whereas knowledge is power. Remember how Du Bois recognized that in his text. And an educated and intelligent people can neither be held in nor reduced to slavery. Therefore, be it resolved that we will insist upon the establishment of good schools for the thorough education of our children throughout the state, that to this end we will contribute freely and liberally of our means, and will earnestly and persistently urge forward every measure calculated to elevate us to the rank of a wise, enlightened, and Christian people, resolved that we solemnly urge the parents and guardians of the young and rising generation, by the sad recollection of our forced ignorance and degradation in the past, and by the bright and inspiring hopes of the future, to see that schools are at once established in every neighborhood, and when so established, to see to it that every child of proper age is kept in regular attendance upon the same. This statement not only speaks to the attitude and determination of Black people at this time in the 19th century of the United States, it also captures the magnitude and meaning of education even in our lifetime. And as a consequence of that, it is our role today to assure that that debt that African Americans, that debt that is paid to African Americans for the work they did in establishing the very development of what we understand today as public school education in the United States, is one that can only be repaid with the assurance that every child in this country has educational opportunity that is equal and just as a civil and human right. For those that are interested in reading further, I again encourage you to consider the text that we shared in the second lesson, Self-Taught, African American Education in Slavery and Freedom by Heather Andrea Williams. And again, as I've shared often throughout this lesson, Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880 by W.E.B. Du Bois, an incident in the life of a slave girl as told by herself, Harriet A. Jacobs. It is my pleasure to do this series with Kaplan Education Foundation, and look forward to the conversation that will occur next. Thank you.
Hello and welcome everybody to the Privileging Higher Education series, which is sponsored by the Kaplan Educational Foundation. During our first season, as you already know, and this is our third lesson, we are addressing the Black educational experience in the United States as testaments of courage, freedom, resilience, and dignity. I want us to stay there for a moment because that's really our message. We speak from a place of positivity and making sure that we speak of the history of education in the United States to demonstrate the true strength and resiliency of the Black population and the many populations that have been kept out of education and made education a privilege and not a right. I am so happy to be here with a person that has really brought this type of awareness to me, to Rhoda, but also to our scholars at the Kaplan Leadership Program, Ewari Osayende. I cannot tell you how delighted I am that he is the person that is putting this together as the founder of Origin, that provides a consultant service that discusses issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that it looks to work with companies and organizations that are interested in addressing exactly this, as we are at the Kaplan Educational Foundation. In this third lesson, also we have Rhoda Tamoklo. Can't think of two better people to discuss these matters. And so I'm just going to open it up. I am your student. I certainly will be learning a lot from you. And so welcome, Ewari. And thank you, Rhoda, for being here. Welcome.
Of course. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you for making sure this happened. And thank you to Kaplan for supporting this as well. So I want to make sure we dive right in, because today's lesson, even though it was 19 minutes, like I couldn't believe it. It went so fast. So Ewari, please, what does this history teach us about the Black community's understanding of itself? This time, seeing that there were Black people who were born free and those that escaped slavery working together to support those who were considered contraband. Please.
Yes. Again, just want to say thank you to yourself, Rhoda, and the great way that you have been kind of a conduit of conversation here. Certainly Nancy, being such a generous host for this series. The question is a very important one because, of course, as you recall from the slides, that period in American history in U.S. history was a very crucial one, a very violent one. We're talking about a community of people as that map. I shared that map purposefully to indicate that the majority, the overwhelming majority, indeed, of African people in the United States at that time, 1850, 1860, 1865, was overwhelmingly in the South, in the Deep South, indeed. And, I think that if we were to look at a demographic today, it has changed, certainly, but the predominant portion of the Black community probably still is in the South. So we're dealing here with a community that is faced with sheer violence. There's a war going on. The South has seceded. The reason why those folks were called contraband was because they literally stole themselves. Consider that. These are people who stole themselves from the persons that owned them, crossed enemy lines, quote unquote, joined the ranks, fled into the ranks of the Union Army. The Union, in receiving them, called them contraband because they indeed were receiving what they understood was stolen goods. Okay? So that's the first piece. The second piece that I want folks to really appreciate is so in addressing that, I'm speaking to the courage, right? Mm-hmm. Testaments of courage.
Yeah.
Resiliency. Then you have two different communities. There were communities of Africans who were born free. Tunis Campbell. Tunis Campbell was born free to a pretty well-to-do family in New Jersey. Mm-hmm. Attended an Episcopal school in New York, and had enough understanding, enough drive, enough verve, and enough support to pursue the development of schools in the North, both in New York and New Jersey. He could have lived the rest of his life in the comfort of knowing that his contribution was secure. Then you have the person of Harriet A. Jacobs, which is a story that, we talk about different movies being made. My goodness, this woman survived for 7 years in the attic. Why didn't she leave? People ask. She didn't leave because she had 2 kids on the plantation.
Oh my goodness.
She had 2 kids on the plantation that her that her owner threatened to sell away from her if she didn't give herself to him. And so rather than escape so that she could be free, she hid where she could watch her children on the plantation for 7 years. Just to give you a sense of who these persons are, who these people are. That free Black persons would work with escaped Black persons, that both would return into the heat and hotness of slavery itself. We're talking about people who, you know, we highlight people like Harriet Tubman, and we lift them up as they ought to be. But we ought to appreciate that that spirit that was in Harriet was in that generation of Black people at large. And that the idea and sense of community was clearly in display in the development of the public education system in this country, which started out as an investment in assuring that Black people have the ability to learn, to gain knowledge, to gain skills, to pursue freedom, would lay the foundation for the development of the public education system itself in this country.
I just want to go back to one piece of what you were talking about. You said people stole themselves. And I just want to like revisit this for a minute, because I don't think people understand that what it means for someone to be property. The fact that in a land built on where you're here to be free, you had to steal yourself. Yeah. And I think a bit about like the Black women's position. I'm gonna be honest, this map just brought me Stacey Abrams vibes, right? Like people like, why Georgia? Why so contentious? And just hearing, so I didn't realize Harriet Jacobs stayed there because of her children. And I wonder how that, we don't have to unpack it now, we'll move on. But I just want to be like, wonder what that means. You know, people always talk about, think Black women and Black women did this. What it would mean that your children followed the condition of the mother. I remember you brought this, I think it was lesson 2. Right. The children followed the condition of the mother. And that this woman placed herself in another form of bondage, right?
That's right.
To ensure her children. And then even when she got freedom, she's like, I'm going right on back.
Going right back.
And I always think about, I have some friends who are like, oh, you work in nonprofit. Didn't you go to that fancy school? Why don't you make up tons of money? I said, listen, you know, I survived where people didn't. I got to reach back. And so, and I want to, going back to public education, could you talk a little bit more about what the omission on the fundamental role of African Americans played in the development of public education and what that represents for our time? Just, yes. I feel like there's so much in that.
So what's going to become a theme, if it hasn't already been for those that have followed us from the first lesson, is that white supremacy, we hear a lot about white supremacy, and a lot of it is actually on point in terms of its facts. But white supremacy as a concept, as an ideology, requires that Black achievement not exist. There can be no Black achievement under the ideology of the worldview of white supremacy. Because why? Because white people are supreme. If white people are supreme, the people who they are against, in this case, Black folks, cannot achieve. Black achievement contradicts the conception of white supremacy. Therefore, and the history will follow this out. If you read the book that I mentioned, Black Reconstruction in America by W.E.B. Du Bois, he lays this out very clearly. If you want to have a clearer understanding of what Black achievement in the United States can look like, all you need to do is go find out what Black folks did during Reconstruction, fresh out of slavery. For the next decade, you see an astronomical leap of the Black community forward. That leap became a threat to working class white folks, the white planter class in the South, and as a consequence of both, we get the Klan. That's how the Klan gets developed. Klan wasn't around during slavery. Klan comes around after slavery with the intention to put down by violent terrorism the achievement potential of Black folks. And it became an organized effort because we begin to see the development of these laws that we now understand as Jim Crow segregation. So in this case, Black people established the foundation, the scales, if you will, for the development of public education. Prior to what Black folks did, as indicated in the presentation, people who received what we understand as compulsory education were rich folks who could afford to bring folks into their home, or if you were affiliated with a church or some type of philanthropic organization. That meant that the majority, I want to make that clear, the majority of white folks in the South in the 1800s did not get what we understand today as public education. That changes coming out of the Reconstruction. After Black folks have set up the foundation for public education, white folks organized in the South and said, okay, we're gonna take it from you, right? Separate but equal. But we know later in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education recognized, no, it's not equal. It's separate for sure. It's in fact segregated, and it's unequal. They set up a different circumstance, providing Black folks subpar education, if any at all, because they then took that community and placed them back on those plantations as sharecroppers. And so there is an injustice that occurs that has become part of this legacy of unequal education that Black people continue to wrestle with and resist against and organize against to this day.
What really struck me about this whole section and kind of where we've landed is I'm struck by how much collateral damage occurs by continuing to allow white supremacy to kind of be this like standard bearer, and frankly, like a huge section of the white community. I know that I've seen some like LinkedIn wars, different wars, but what I've been struck by, people always say, hey, there are poor people in rural areas, there are poor people in the interior,
Sure.
There are people suffering. And my response to that is, I know that. Yeah. I that's why I work in education, that's why I work in community college, that's where the people go. But I'm unsure how we can reach people if they still feel that they are dependent on their identity and their value being tied to their race. And I find that everybody loses. And I think where people would like us to have a meritocracy, I think instead we are opting for mediocrity. Because if we're tying how we validate people or even invest in communities by things that people can't control, you can't control what zip code you're born into or what skin color or what, gender, or there's so many different pieces of identity. And then I see, this year, and I'm like, the people that got to stay home were the people with mostly people with degrees, the people that were protected, so that when times get tough, you start to see the cracks in us continuing to hold on to that founding ideology. And a question I really want to get to is, how are our conceptions of race and education informed by this history?
Yes, our conception very clearly, as you were talking, what was coming to mind for me was the actual con, and I'm using this word very purposefully, the con that has been played on poor, impoverished, working class white folks, however you want to describe that community. I encourage persons who are, like, what are you trying to say? Just go read the stories of former white militia members. Go read the stories of former Klan members, and listen to them talk about how they were bought a conception of identity as superior without need for doing anything more than operating in that identity. That when you can appreciate what whiteness has meant historically and the currency that it still has that enables someone who is a real estate tycoon to convince people that his class exploits every day, right? Exploits every day, that they have something in common more than the Black folks, the Hispanic folks, the Asian folks that he disparages at every opportunity. That's the con that continues to create the divisions in our society that enable the restrictions with respect to education, with respect to housing, with respect to employment, to not just exist, but to be reified generation after generation. Someone has to come along, whether it be from the white community, whether it be from some other community, but there has to become a critical voice that stands up and says, hold on. This is a con that is being played on you. You actually have more in common with the very people that you have been taught to despise than you realize. And that once you understand that and then organize with them to achieve the very same things, we're going to get a lot further. But until then, this concern is a concern of the Black community, because that mentality represents the continuation of that violent obstacle to our achievement and success. And we cannot stand for that.
Like, I want to thank you so much for even bringing this piece out, because we take our students, to a bunch of different places. But I remember one year when we were in DC for college tours, and we took them to the National African American Museum of History and Culture. And, when you go in the basement and they start with sugar, the one thing that stood out to me is they talked about rebellions that were occurring with poor whites and slaves working together.
Right.
And then you watch how the legislation, you see how in the previous lesson too, you talked about how they were putting in laws to punish anyone teaching people to read. And I wonder how much of this, I want to get to some recommendations before we kick it to Nancy to close, but I wonder how much of this do you feel is laid at the feet of Americans simply having differences of opinion versus the United States government having white supremacy as its goalpost, legislating the separation, making it illegal for people to marry, making it illegal to be, like, how much, I feel like, are we putting it too much on the people, or how much is it like the country needs to make a stand from a government level? I'm just ripping up, we're gonna close, but I just wanted to get your take.
No, that's fine. I appreciate everything you're saying. I mean, these are real questions. Well, what I would share is that, again, reminding us that government is us, that when we vote, we're sending representatives to DC to represent our interests. But to your point, there is a narrative that these parties have embraced that work to reinscribe these social divisions that were erected that go all the way back again to slavery.
Yeah.
The work that needs to be done, of course, education is a primary role in that. And the government has a critical role to play in that. It reminds me of right quick, one of Trump's final acts was to essentially bar racial equity training, social justice training for federal agencies or those organizations contracted with federal agencies. And of course, again, when you can appreciate the attitude, not just of the person of Trump, but in this case of the party that backs him, it becomes apparent. And that's not to say that, the Democrats are, shining light in this regard. We can have a whole nother conversation on that too.
All the conversations.
But what is critical for me, as I see where the country is presently, and I see that commentators trying to make sense of the divisions that are present, we cannot overlook the way in which we are witnessing this history that we're talking about be embodied and expressed in the persons of folks who are showing up at rallies, who are indeed coming armed. This is a direct line to this history. They bear the emblems of this history. So there is no denying the impact this history has had with respect to the conception of these folks who would rather maintain a prejudice, maintain a system of oppression that they embody in their person, rather than allow for the true development of democracy in our society, which is indeed a multiracial democracy at this point in this nation's history.
I don't think I could add to that, Nancy. I think that does it for me.
You know,
thank you, Amari.
When I said before that I am a student of this, I am a student. I always have been a student of the history of the United States, of colonization. As a Puerto Rican woman, I have, my own experiences with what being a colony is, and also what comes with the justification of abusing people based on their race, simply to enrich ourselves. Because no one can ever tell me that any race is inferior. But however, you needed a reason to enslave. And so, I've been asked, when did we decide to put this series together? And one of those reasons was, and we started to talk with Aware and Rhoda in June at some point of, as we were talking to our own students, of how we were going to kind of take it further, right? And this series comes as a result of taking the issue and the protests that happened over the summer further. Because while we are not here, and I'm sorry I'm saying we, but certainly I can say the purpose of this is not to just educate others. It is also to celebrate greatness that comes with resilience and dignity. And again, I've been really, it's one of those things that I go over these presentations and I read resiliency, and I hear, and I am so proud of putting this forward, and so proud that the Kaplan Educational Foundation, whose mission is really to bring students of color, specifically and apologetically Black and Latinos of color, to the most selective institutions, not because they're selective, but simply because we have always felt that the doors that were closed must be open. Mm-hmm. And we knew that was not a process that was going to be done just by us saying we're here. Right. We understood that just like everything else that we have done, there has to be a push, and there has to be, it's unfortunate, right? But the fact is that we have had to work to do this. Yes, we are so happy to have some amazing partners in the last, 15 years of people that said, I am here and we are here. But that stands on the history of many of the schools that were created to be very specifically for men, for white men, for Christian Protestant men, for landowners. And so as you were mentioning it, Warren, as we talk about the division right now that it happens, and I don't want it to be unsaid today, this is a week after the election. Yeah. This country is divided, but I want it to be known, we are not the dividers. We are not. And that whole discussion irks me.
Yeah.
Because,
exactly. It's we have to be very clear. And as educators, we have, I would say, we have a charge. We have a charge to be clear. We have a charge to be honest. And we have a charge to speak from a place of historic truth. If you cannot back up what you're saying with the evidence of history itself, then you ought not speak it. Let's be clear. And in this respect, what we're talking about is when you say, no, we didn't create this division. Here we are. Who in their right mind is going to say that the Democrat candidate for the presidency, Joe Biden, did not win that election based on every other election that has ever occurred in our lifetime and before? Yet, we have not just an individual, but at this point, an entire party that is saying We are not going to acknowledge that.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a moment for kumbaya, let's come together, because coming together means accepting, not just the refusal of a party to accept the fact that they lost the presidency, though they don't have a problem accepting the fact that they won the Senate. It's not interesting, but they lost the presidency. We are also looking at the erosion of the very democracy itself. I do work and have traveled all over the world, working and listening to leaders at the grassroots level in places in Africa, in places in Asia, in places in the Middle East, and listening to them talk about the struggles that they go to lift up democracy in their nations. Imagine how they must think about this country right now that has raised itself as a standard bearer with respect to democracy. It's an insult. Plain and simple, it's an insult. And it's going to be up to the people of this country to determine if, in fact, do we want white supremacy or do we want multiracial democracy? Do we want neo-fascism or do we want a multiracial democracy? Do we want, a quasi-dictatorship or do we want a multiracial democracy? This is the question of the moment. And it will be answered by the people of this country. There's no other way.
Yeah, I agree.
As someone who is a student of this history, let me be clear. I put my faith in the people. Because the people I come from, we never back away. Our only path is forward. And we understand that the fruits of our labor as contributors to what this country has now become are ours to experience and enjoy and to share with the rest of this community that we call the United States. That's the lesson of today, because it was the foundation that was laid by those formerly enslaved Africans that led to the very system of education that we all take for granted every September when we send our children to school.
You know what this reminds me of? I remember this year listening to a senator say slavery was a necessary evil. And the only thing that I could think of is if that were to be held true, what has to be done? What penance is to be paid? That the founding fathers saw it fit to commit a necessary evil. So then, as with any sin, it must be paid for. And I'm not saying, monetary, but this country has a history of its freedom being mortgaged with Black bodies. And I think it's how many years later? This is the same argument. It's the same argument. So I would hope that we as a country, all of us, every color, every hue, every creed, look at this as the moment to build this as a country with liberty and justice for all.
I again just want to thank you both for joining us and to make sure that it is clear to everyone that is watching, will rewatch, I certainly will, that will share this, that it is so important that we take into account the understanding that we can no longer separate government from education. We cannot separate current politics, past politics from education and how we got to segregated education, to the exclusion of people of color from the educational system. However, we always fought for it. We always made it. And I that is where I stand. Somebody that has had the ability to work with students who have faced many barriers, but show up every day and outdo students of greater resources. Let's be clear that is done again. I love, Eduardo, that you always bring us back to stay away from exceptionalism and to say, yes, this leader was amazing, but I want you to know that that's what we're made of, that yes, exceptional, and we have to honor that. But the reality is that there were so many There were so many that were just us. And so I don't want that to ever, and again, as someone who runs this program like this, of trying to get students to the top schools, I want to make sure that it is known that that is exactly what we have to continue to fight for. It's not for the few to get in. It's not for the few to get into leadership position. It's to make sure that there is a clear pathway for people to make it, and people of color, and for our communities to be represented at every table.
Yes.
So I don't want to leave without giving you both the opportunity. Rhoda, if you could provide some information about the Kaplan Educational Foundation, where to go to get more information, and then Eware, if you could share where we can learn more about your work as an activist, as a writer, as the founder of this amazing organization. And so, but I'll start out with Rhoda, and then we'll end with Eware.
Sure. Yes. So excited. So with the Kaplan Educational Foundation, you can click the link and go to www.kaplanedfoundation.org. You'll also find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Please like and follow. Nancy also is a Forbes contributor. Please like and follow her posts as well. Over to Eware.
Yes, thanks again. You can learn more about the work of Origin, the Oceande Racial Justice Initiative, at our website, which is racial-justice.org. And looking forward to our lesson next week. Next Wednesday, we'll be looking at the 1900s and the resegregation of public education, the segregation of public education, and we're also going to touch on the resegregation of public education as well, and certainly the consequence that has had not just on the African American community, but on all communities in this country. Thank you both, and I'm looking forward to continuing to work with you as we go through this series together.
It is an honor, and we will see you next week at the same time. So thank you, everyone. Stay woke.